Good afternoon and welcome to day 2 of Super Bowl 58 Radio Row. I am Kayla Brad. I'm here with my partner Roy Kessel, Sports Philanthropy Network, to talk about some very important issues that don't get talked about enough. We're doing this interview virtually, by the way. Brian, tell us where you're coming from.
Charlotte, North Carolina.
There you go. And you're going to be on Radio Row next year in New Orleans, right?
That's the plan.
All right. So I want to keep everybody just a little bit on suspense about what we're doing, why we're doing this interview virtually. By the way, fun fact for all of the people watching this right now, our last virtual interview was earlier this morning with former commissioner of the NFL, Paul Tagliabue. So Brian, little small thing, tiny thing to follow up on. You're on the heels of Paul Tagliabue, okay?
Oh, big shoes to fill, but I'm up for the challenge.
Good to have him as your opening act for this day at Super Bowl Radio Row.
I just hope everybody doesn't tune out. That's all.
You are great. I think one of the things that really excites me about this interview is what we're going to talk about. So let's bring it back. Let's talk about Brian, the boy who loves sports. And then we'll just sort of evolve the story as we go along. Okay, Brian?
Absolutely. I mean,
tell us about your childhood.
Yeah. So, I'm a New York guy, born and bred, grew up just outside New York City in Long Island, New York. And anybody who knows anything about Long Island and grew up there knows that it's a very popular sports town. I mean, you've got 2 NFL teams, 2 NHL teams, 2 MLB teams. To name just a few, of course. And then don't forget about upstate New York, which technically is part of New York. But if you're a downstater like me, you kind of brushed them off a little bit. So athletics has always been a big part of my life growing up. And it was something that got me through my youth unscathed and out of trouble and, helped kind of steer me down the road of success and into my current role in my profession as a physician assistant. But my career actually started out as an athletic trainer. And again, that goes back to my youth, growing up in and around athletics and having an interest in healthcare at a young age and wanting to be able to mesh the two, working in athletics and doing healthcare. And I found that going the road of being an athletic trainer was the best way for me at that time. And so fast forward 20 plus years later, I'm still kind of doing it to some degree. Most of my time these days is spent as a physician assistant doing orthopedic surgery, but it all goes back to my roots as a child. Playing sports, I played basketball, baseball. We always got together and played outdoor roller hockey with our friends in the neighborhood. We played pickup games of football, even though I didn't play organized. I pretty much played every sport, which is in stark contrast to a lot of young kids today who play and specialize primarily in one. So, like a lot of people my age who grew up playing sports, we played multiple sports. We played year round. And so that's really where it all began for me.
I love that. And let's pause here for a second. You mentioned, that you specialize in orthopedic surgery and things like that. I work with a lot of, moms and dads who are single sport advocates, right? So the only way my kid is going to go into Major League Baseball is if that's all my kid does is baseball. Then these kids have, pitcher's elbow when they're done and they're not even making it to college. Multi-sport versus single sport. What's your take?
I'm kind of old school with this. I still am a big advocate and proponent for multi-sport athletes and kids participating in multiple sports for a lot of reasons, none of which are healthcare related. It just gives you a very good physiologic base to work off of. It really helps kids identify what their true passions are. It allows them to be more well-rounded, not only as an athlete, but as a person, especially if you're doing not only an individual sport, but a team sport as well. And so I'm a big proponent of multiple sports. I understand where the trends have gone. But as you work in healthcare, you realize that physically, this is actually a detrimental thing too. You see a lot of these more chronic sports injuries popping up in the younger population these days. And it all goes back to them being single sport athletes who play year round versus when we were kids or when I was a kid and I played multiple sports throughout the year. So definitely a big proponent for the multi-sport.
And what's interesting to me, Brian, when you talk about that, right, is I have not seen any data that demonstrates, or not a great amount of data that demonstrates that kids specializing in a sport ultimately do better long term, but through that concentration, right? It seems like most of the data supports burnout, repetitive use injuries, all kinds of things like that. And I think that what I'm curious from your end, if you've seen anything where there is a superior performance from kids that specialize.
To be honest, I don't. I don't see that. If that's true or not, I'm not quite certain. But I do know. But like you said, Roy, you're actually absolutely correct. The literature would suggest otherwise. And in fact, there's been a lot of studies and books written about this. In fact, I love Malcolm Gladwell. Do you guys read Malcolm Gladwell? Was
Yeah.
it the tip? Was it the
The
tipping
tipping
point? Or
point?
one of his books goes into great detail about this subject actually, and really goes to show you why single sport athlete isn't necessarily a given path to success as a professional, and that is that you only really need so many hours of focus and
10,000
training in one.
hours. Yeah.
You got it. Yep. And that usually can happen within 10 years. And in fact, a lot of the professional athletes that you see today didn't specialize in their particular sport until well into their teens, or sometimes even not until college. So it goes against everything people kind of tend to think.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think one of the things that's interesting to me, Brian, is we work with a lot of athletes in the NIL space through our program called NIL for Good. And one of the number one issues that they raise is the concept of mental health, right? And a lot of that relates to the burnout that they had experienced when they specialize in their sport, their entire life, their entire self-worth is wrapped up in that one sport. And I know you focus on, the athletic training side and the physical injuries, but I don't know how much you hear from the athletes as they're going through that rehab process about their thoughts on mental health.
Oh, that's always an issue. And it's obviously it's not my area of expertise, but it is something that's very important in athletics overall. I've got a lot of colleagues that do specialize in these areas, and I lean on them tremendously for some advice sometimes and for referrals. Um, you know, the mental aspect can absolutely affect the physical, not just in the performance, but also in the recovery from injuries and getting back on the field or court of play. And so the mental component is huge, and it's a vital component of the athlete's success long term.
so Brian, let's talk about that and just take it a step further, right? So we went from single sport to multi-sport to mental health, and now we add on it. We talk about going pro, and you're playing the same position X number of plays per game over and over every week. And it's not Pop Warner anymore. It's massive crushing hits and blows. And the bigger, stronger, badder, faster you are is cool, right? So when you're talking about, these athletes and the orthopedic surgery, I'm looking around Radio Row and I'm looking at, oh no, there's probably about 1,000 people here. There's probably one or 200 athletes plus the media. I know a lot of them. I'm looking at guys I can see like, oh yeah, I remember his knee blew out. Oh, I remember his hips are, making him walk a little lopsided. Guys with their pinkies, bent
Oh
backwards.
yeah.
You see this day after day after day. We understand the mental health takes its toll, but let's talk about that excruciating, maybe it's not excruciating, maybe it's just chronic pain that players are playing with week after week because they don't want to get cut. They don't want to lose their starting positions. What's the toll when you finally get these guys 3, 4, 5 or more years into their career?
Oh, I mean, so let's preface this by saying we hear a lot of these days about the concussions and stuff, and I'm not a concussion expert. I come out and say that right away because I know that'll be a question or a topic at some point here. But we hear a lot about the long-term effects of that, the head injuries and whatnot. But what in that discussion, we often overlook just the regular physical ailments, the sprained knees, the torn ligaments, the surgical procedures that they've had done, sometimes multiple ones on the same joint, and how that affects them long term. And no so more than the sport of football. And historically, football's been one of the sports where you see a lot of guys come into the league already beaten up to some degree physically, then have to try and prolong their career as much as they can, and then end up leaving the league even worse than when they started. So it takes a tremendous physical toll on them, and those are repercussions that are felt for the rest of their lives. And like you said, I see this daily. We treat a lot of professional athletes down here in the Charlotte area. Believe it or not, it's not one of the bigger cities in the country, but it's a very popular sports town. We have a huge racing community down here. We see a lot of ex NASCAR guys, football players. A lot of people from the South are big in college football and stuff, and we see a lot of ex college football players. So we see in our practices and in my practice, I see it all the time. The remnants of those injuries from college and surgery that they've had done to sustain them and get them through their career. So it's sometimes doesn't get spoken about enough. And so, sitting there on Radio Row, Kayla and Roy, I'm sure you guys notice some of the older athletes coming through, and they start to look near mortal.
Yeah.
At that point in their career, and you're like, that's not the guy I remember with the
And
2%
that
body
goes,
fat running a 4.340 down the sideline. Like, but it makes it hit home, right?
well, it does, and that goes back to the issues that you talk about from the youth sports and concussions. And I think one of the challenges, and value your input on this, right? Athletic trainers are given a huge amount of responsibility. Um, and until you get to really the elite levels, right, there's not enough athletic trainers even to go around. You think of what happens at high schools, where most high schools don't even have full-time athletic trainers, much less youth sports programs. And how are you able to balance in that capacity, not only dealing with all the bumps, bruises, sprains, taping ankles and wrists and everything else, ice packs, but then you're also charged essentially with being a monitor of head impacts, so you're supposed to know what goes on the field while you're facing the bench taping somebody's ankle.
Well, when it comes to the world of athletic training, Roy, even though I've retired my credential 2 years ago, I'm still very much part of that community. I mean, I kind of always say that I was kind of born an athletic trainer and grew into my PA role. It's where I started my career. It's what got me interested in this field in the first place. And it's where I have some of my best memories and stories working with collegiate, high school, and professional athletes. So, yeah, I mean, in fact, nowadays, there's probably a shortage of athletic trainers nationwide. And, there's what people don't really understand is the huge drop off in resources, salaries, and staffing once you get out of the professional tier. It's a huge drop off, and it literally goes from the elite league, like the NFL, and then the next league below it. You would think you're walking into like a high school in the middle of the countryside where there's not. I mean, it's a huge drop off, and probably I've seen from what I've seen, it's no more apparent than like in a sport like baseball, where you just have so many minor league programs, so many collegiate programs. There's just not enough people to fill all those voids, and so when you talk about balancing those things as an athletic trainer, can you imagine being the trainer in a minor league team at the AAA level? Keep in mind, because I did a year there with the Orioles organization back in 2002, 2003. Not only being in charge of taking care of the athletes, but then being in charge of the equipment when you're on the road, and being in charge of the travel plans and having to schedule the arrangements and make the arrangements for travel for the team. So that's the kind of stuff that as athletic trainers, they're responsible for when you start getting out of that tier, that top tier level. Now, guys in the NFL obviously have it a lot better. They're traveling with they've got trucks where they just throw everything in and it shows up at the field, and they have a whole team that unpacks it and sets it up and gets them ready while they're focused on taking care of the team players. And so it's a much different world, and not a lot of people really understand that, especially when they're constantly surrounded by the professionals at the highest level.
So, Brian, let's talk about that. Constantly surrounded by the professionals at the highest level. I won't say names, but I'll say Chicago Bears Super Bowl champion once said to me, Kayla, don't be deceived. When you see a player going into that medical tent on the sidelines, one of two things is happening. I guarantee it. Doc Needles is in there, and he is either draining something or injecting something. That's what happens in those tents. And again, we're talking Chicago Bears Super Bowl champion. So we got to go back a ways. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Packer fan said that.
Yeah.
A
But
long time back, just for the record, for all of those Bear fans that may be watching, a long time back.
but we're not talking smack.
No.
Brian, what are your thoughts about what happens on the sidelines in the med tents before guys, God forbid, are taken back to the locker room? Is it enough? And are you comfortable with it?
The whole medical tent thing, that's a new phenomenon that hasn't been around too long. One of the reasons I think they instilled the tent was because of concussions, and in order to get a good concussion evaluation, you really need that external stimuli to be blocked. Plus, they felt the player's privacy was being violated by these, cameras getting up in their face while they're trying to do a sideline, evaluation. And so I'm not so sure too much more happens on the sideline tent. But when you get back into the locker room, that's a whole different ballgame. And that's where a lot of the stuff really goes down. And, that can be anything from injection therapies, draining fluid from joints, administering medications. You hear about Toradol a lot, which was a big topic of conversation about a year or two ago. And I'm sure still is. And,
Yeah.
and those kinds of things. You have to remember, and this is a big thing that you have to take away from this conversation on this particular topic. The physicians that care for these guys, they're there for the organization. They're there for the team, the organization to have their best players on the field. That's why they're there. So nobody makes money, nobody gets paid, nobody bears the riches of the success unless there is success. So their main goal is to make sure that everyone's performing at their top level safely and healthy. But those decisions and those treatments are sometimes dictated not by sometimes the best option, but sometimes just the best option at that moment. And that's not always the best. It's not always the best in the long term or overall outcome.
And we see that from a lot of the players when we talk to them, right? There's a lack of trust that goes on between the players often in the organization because the players know, like I'm a commodity to the organization. The organization wants to quote unquote use me up, right? So if I get beat up and battered and they can poke and prod me and shoot me up to play a few more downs or a few more games this season, that's great. I'm a disposable. I'm like a disposable razor. You're going to throw it away at the end, and it doesn't matter. And I think that's where it's interesting to me that there's a lot of attacks, right, and a lot of people pointing fingers at who deserves the blame for this. And surprisingly for me, one of the groups that gets off relatively unscathed in this space is the NFLPA because they're charged with being the body that is supposed to, no pun intended, protect the body of the athletes, right? And so, the league people point the finger at because that's where it's easy to see the money goes there or the teams. But talk about that from a liability perspective, right? You're not in the legal side of things, but who's supposed to protect the players?
Yeah, and and I'm not here. I have nothing but the utmost respect for all the providers, the trainers, the physicians that help these players out and work for these organizations. But let's be honest, this is a business now, and there's a lot of money at stake. And so there's a lot of different influences that these people have that they don't normally see in private practice or out in the general public. So you have to all take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, I hate to bash them, but the NFLPA has historically been probably one of the least nurturing and supportive of their players, especially once they're retired. And that's just a fact. If you look back over the years, when you compare them to the other big sporting leagues and everything. So, they've done a little bit better job. I know there's the NFL Trust, which now players have access to, and some other resources, even Sports Philanthropy Network as well, which has resources for players, former. And so these things that have been established for them are really vital. And current players need to know that these resources will be there and will be available for them. And what I'm doing with my consulting company is providing an outlet for those current players now too, to be like, hey, listen, I don't know if I feel like I'm getting the things I need, or if I'm getting an objective point of view here. Is there a resource where I can go to get some help? And so that's why I've established the consulting company I've established. And I'm sorry if I jumped the gun on anything there, but I think it kind of goes with what you were asking as far as, who looks out for these guys, especially when they're in the midst of their career, at the peak of their performance, and potentially, facing an injury or something.
Yeah, so I think you walked right into it, and it's the perfect spot, because the question that I was going to ask you is like, when did you start seeing the problem and figuring out that you had a solution?
Wow. If I really sit down and think about it, it's probably been something that kind of got implanted in my brain years ago, and it's just been festering and brewing and growing ever since. I mentioned that I had done some time in AAA with the Orioles organization back in like 2001, 2003, and that was an eye-opening experience for me, because I was there every day. I worked every home game. I was treating players in the clubhouse, in the locker room, on the field. I got the behind the scenes, experience, and I got to see everything. And it kind of changed my perspective on professional sports just as a whole, because I got to see kind of how things operated in the back end, where cameras aren't allowed, where media doesn't go. So right around that time was kind of when the seed got planted. And then just throughout my career, having come in contact with a lot of former players from the collegiate level, working in college, and throughout my career working in high schools and stuff, being in the operating room and seeing these patients in surgery, and kind of actually bearing witness to the firsthand result of the injuries that they sustained over the years, and then having to treat them afterwards and possibly redo surgeries, or to revise stuff. You really kind of opens your eyes to, like, wow, could this have been avoided? Could something have been done differently back then? How would they know, or who would they have gone to, or what would they have done to maybe have this outcome end up a little bit differently than it has now? And in some cases, maybe there wasn't any other option. Maybe that was the best option. But I've always been like, well, listen, if there's anything I can do to kind of help them and change that, then I want to do it. And so last year was when I really kind of hit a turning point, or a tipping point, like we mentioned earlier, that I said, I think it's time.
I love that. And as we wind this down, I know that we have, some people watching live right now. We also know this is going to, get repurposed. It'll be on more content. So as people are seeing this, Brian, and they know a guy who needs your help, and I'm sure that it's not just guys. I'm sure you're helping women in sports as well. But as we see people who need help, how can they find you?
So I'm super easy to find. I'm not hiding behind any big company or resources or anything like that. It's a one-man solo operation. It's just me, and I'm out there kind of front and
I love
center.
it.
So, all my contact information can be found at the booth there. I think you guys have flyers, and you have the QRS code where they can scan and get all of
Yep.
my contact information on social media, my email, even a phone number that they can reach out to me. And really, I just want to establish a relationship. That's what it's all about. I can't help people if they can't trust me and where I've been and what I'm trying to do. And so I tell you, hey, just email me, shoot me a text, shoot me a message on the website. Anything that you can do to get in contact with me through a mutual contact, if that's what it takes. I'm an open book. I'm happy to help. And in some cases, I may not be able to help you. But how do you know if you don't ask, right? And that's what I've always been
That's right.
told in my career too. If you don't ask, you'll never know. So that's basically it.
Okay, and I couldn't agree with you more. For anybody who's watching this and they're not on site with us, as we close out,
Yeah,
just go ahead and state your email address really clearly, and the
yeah.
website.
So the website is www.ilpsports.com, and the email is ilpsportsconsultants@gmail. And if you go to the website, there's links to all that information. You can watch a short little video. It basically introduces myself again, talks about what I do, and you can watch that short little video. It'll kind of highlight, the services I offer. And I want to be very clear about this. I can work with anybody at any level with any problem you have related to sports and injuries. And everything can be customized and tailored. So don't feel like you look at my plans or what options I have and you're feeling locked in. Reach out to me. We'll figure it out together. And the other thing I wanted to say was, we talked a little bit about the former players. I'm willing to do pro bono work for any former NFL, MLB, NHL, you name it, men's or women's, former athletes who maybe were at one point associated with their players association and feel like they're not getting the services or help they need. I'm an open book for them too, and I'm willing to work with them pro bono to help get them on the path to health and feeling good.
I love it. We're really grateful, Brian, for the work you're doing. I'm going to turn it over to Roy and ask him to close us out, but complete gratitude, especially for that pro bono work for the pro teams.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Brian. And I think one of the things that really helps establish that trust and credibility is all the information that you put up on the website transparently for people to go and access without cost and without charge. And your offer of that pro bono work, that's very meaningful. So we appreciate you taking time to be with us today on Radio Row. We appreciate your support and sponsorship of Sports Philanthropy Network. On behalf of Kayla Bradham, I'm Roy Kessel, thanking Brian for joining us today and all of our viewers and listeners. We appreciate you taking time to jump in and learn more about Brian's incredible work and the organization that he's building and how he takes care of things. So for our viewers and listeners, we remind you to live generously. Thank you.
Thank you.